Hey there. Welcome to Midnight Sleep Crime. I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know many of you use this video to fall asleep. So, before you get cozy, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'd love to hear from you. Story 1. The old Farnum estate had been vacant for so long that it had become part of the town's landscape, the way a scar becomes part of a face. Everyone in Millbrook knew it, even if they didn't talk about it. The house stood at the end of a long, tree-choked lane, its iron gates rusted and perpetually chained shut. Vines had crept across its stone facade, and broken shutters dangled like crooked teeth. Teenagers dared each other to sneak onto the property on Halloween nights, whispering about shadows in the windows and sounds echoing from within. But officially, the Farnum house was just another piece of real estate, a neglected mansion caught in legal limbo after decades of unresolved inheritance battles. That changed in early spring, when the title finally cleared and a local realtor named Laura Jennings was tasked with preparing the property for sale. Laura was used to foreclosures and estates, but something about the Farnum property gave her pause. It wasn't just the state of disrepair. Though the broken windows and sagging roof were daunting, it was the sheer weight of the place. Walking through its corridors, dust motes swirling in the shafts of sunlight, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being observed. The silence wasn't empty, it was listening. Her first week on site was devoted to cataloging the rooms. The house was larger than expected, for stories if you counted the attic, with 2 wings and a cellar that stretched beneath nearly half the property. Some of the rooms were time capsules, furniture still draped in sheets, dishes stacked neatly in cabinets, an ancient record player sitting silently in the parlor. Others looked as though someone had fled in haste, leaving belongings mid-use. A glass of water half full on a nightstand, a coat thrown over a chair, a sewing project abandoned with the needle still threaded. But on her 3rd day, Laura found the door. It was tucked at the end of the east wing hallway, nearly hidden behind a warped armoire pushed against the wall. She'd been making her way through with a clipboard, marking which doors led to which rooms, when she noticed the outline. The armoire, heavy as it was, had clearly been moved there deliberately, like a barricade. With effort, she slid it aside, revealing a narrow wooden door that looked entirely out of place. Unlike the rest of the house's ornate, carved entries, this one was plain. No molding, no paneling, just a flat surface painted the same dull beige as the wall. Its only feature was a tarnished brass knob, crusted with verdigris. And when Laura tried it, the knob didn't turn. The door was locked. At first, she thought little of it. Old houses often had locked storage areas, closets with lost keys. But something about this door bothered her. She could hear nothing on the other side, yet when she pressed her palm against it, she swore she felt a faint current of cold air seeping through the cracks. The next day, she returned with tools. The lock resisted, as though it hadn't been turned in decades. But Laura was persistent. After nearly an hour of struggling, with her screwdriver slipping and her nerves growing tight, the old latch gave way with a metallic snap. The knob twisted, and the door creaked open into darkness. She stood in the threshold, heart thudding. The room beyond was small, almost closet-sized, but it didn't feel like storage. Dust lay thick across the floor, yet the air smelled strangely fresh, as though someone had opened the room only recently. Against the far wall sat a wooden trunk. Beside it, stacked neatly, were boxes labeled with dates. The most recent one read, 1998. Laura hesitated. She wasn't supposed to disturb the contents of an estate until they'd been officially inventoried, but curiosity overrode procedure. She stepped inside, her shoes crunching faintly on grit. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid of the trunk. Inside were personal effects, items that seemed impossibly out of place. A pair of sneakers, scuffed and dirt-stained. A denim jacket, folded with care. A wallet containing a driver's license. Laura pulled it out, brushing dust from the plastic window, and froze. The ID was for a young woman named Rebecca Calloway, age 22. The license had expired in 1999. Laura's chest tightened. She knew that name. Everyone in Millbrook did. Rebecca Calloway had been one of the town's most infamous missing persons cases. She'd vanished one summer night after leaving her job at the diner, never to be seen again. Her family had searched for years. Her photograph still hung on the unsolved board at the local sheriff's office. And here was her jacket, her wallet, her license. In a locked room of a house that, according to every record Laura had seen, had been uninhabited since the early 1980s. Her hands shook as she rifled through the boxes. More items emerged, belongings of people Laura recognized from old news stories and whispered gossip. A high school ring. A diary with a girl's name inscribed on the first page. A set of keys attached to a faded novelty keychain. Each box bore a year: 1985, 1989, 1993, 1998. It was impossible. She stumbled back from the trunk, her breath shallow. Every instinct told her to leave the room untouched, to slam the door and pretend she'd never opened it. But the weight of what she'd found pressed harder than fear. These weren't just forgotten belongings. They were evidence. Clues. Maybe even answers. Laura backed out of the room, her mind racing. She had to call someone, police, investigators, anyone, but a part of her hesitated. If she reported it, the sale of the property would be frozen. The estate could turn into a crime scene, dragging her into a storm she wasn't sure she wanted. But the decision was taken from her. That night, lying awake in her small apartment, Laura replayed the discovery again and again. The names, the items, the locked door. Finally, near midnight, she picked up her phone and called Sheriff Tom Garrison. The sheriff listened silently as Laura explained, his gravelly voice only cutting in once. "You're sure? You're absolutely sure about what you found?" "I'm sure," Laura said. Her hands were clammy against the phone. "I saw it with my own eyes." There was a long pause, then the sheriff exhaled heavily. "All right, don't touch anything else. I'll send a team out first thing in the morning." When Laura hung up, the silence of her apartment seemed too deep, too still. She closed her eyes, but sleep never came. Every time she drifted, she saw the door. That plain, locked door that had hidden something the town had been searching for, perhaps for decades. By sunrise, the Farnum estate was crawling with deputies. They dusted the trunk for prints, cataloged each box, photographed every inch of the room. Laura stood aside, hugging herself, trying to explain how she'd found it. Sheriff Garrison was grim, his lined face tighter than usual. "Locked rooms not on the blueprints," one of the deputies reported. "Might have been added later, concealed behind the wall." "Or someone wanted it hidden," Garrison muttered. As the morning wore on, word spread. Curious neighbors gathered at the gate, whispering among themselves. Local reporters showed up, their cameras flashing as deputies carried out the labeled boxes. And then, just before noon, one of the investigators emerged holding a single photograph. It was a Polaroid, edges curled with age. The image was of a young woman, smiling, waving at the camera. The date on the bottom read July 14, 1998. Sheriff Garrison stared at it for a long moment before tucking it into an evidence bag. His eyes flicked to Laura. "You did the right thing," he said. But his tone was heavy, as though he already knew. Opening that door hadn't just unlocked a room. It had opened something far larger, something that might never close again. The Farnum estate was no longer just a haunted house at the edge of town. It was a vault of secrets, grief, and crimes that someone, long after the house was supposed to be empty, had wanted to keep buried. And somewhere in Millbrook, perhaps closer than anyone realized, the collector might still be watching. The October sun slanted across the old Tmont estate, its golden light spilling over the ivy-clad stone walls and fractured window panes. The house had been abandoned for decades, but today it stood on display like a relic pulled out of a museum. A crowd had gathered on the expansive lawn, some curious neighbors who'd lived long enough to remember when the Tmonts hosted elaborate garden parties here, others, real estate speculators, antique dealers, treasure hunters, drawn by the promise of ownership of a piece of forgotten history. The auctioneer's voice carried over the chatter, quick and sharp, his cadence practiced and rhythmic. Folding chairs dotted the grass, bidders sat with numbered paddles in their laps, while others lingered at the edges, preferring to watch rather than buy. Detective Clara Dane moved through the crowd with a deliberate pace. She wasn't here to bid. She was here to observe. 2 weeks ago, She had stood in that locked upstairs room, staring at a body left behind with surgical precision. The crime scene photographs haunted her, blood pooled across hardwood, a carved wooden chair toppled, the window latched from the inside. The estate had been sealed for investigation, but once the coroner cleared the room and the police lifted their hold, the house reverted to its legal limbo. The bank wanted it sold. Clara felt something was wrong about auctioning it so soon. Evidence could still be hiding within these walls, not just fingerprints or fibers, but whispers in the wood, secrets embedded in the architecture. But money moved faster than justice in towns like Harlow. She tucked herself behind a knot of antique dealers arguing about whether the Tmont estate's library would yield rare first editions. Their whispers reached her ears. "Most of the collection rotted with the damp," said one man with a sharp nose. "But there might be hidden safes. Families like this always had safes. And skeletons," another chuckled, unaware of the cruel irony. The auctioneer raised his voice. "We begin with Lot 1, an assortment of antique furniture discovered in the main hall." Assistants carried out faded armchairs, a cracked oak sideboard, a mirror clouded with dust. The crowd murmured as prices climbed. Clara's gaze never left the house. Its hollow windows seemed to follow her, as if the estate itself was a silent witness, waiting to tell her what it had seen. She drifted toward the porch, where bidders milled during breaks. Her badge gave her a presence that drew attention but also parted conversations. An older woman leaned on a cane near the steps, staring at the house with the kind of focus that went beyond curiosity. Clara approached. "You seem familiar with the place," Clara said softly. The woman looked up, her eyes watery blue. "I grew up in Harlow. My mother worked for the Tremonts as a maid. I played in these gardens when I was a girl." "Then you knew the family?" Claire asked. The woman hesitated, lowering her voice. "Knew them, but not well. They kept to themselves. Strange people. Always locking doors. Always keeping certain rooms closed, even when no one was in them." Clara's attention sharpened. "Certain rooms?" The woman nodded, her lips tightening. "That upstairs room, the one with the body, that was locked even back then. I never saw inside. We were told it was storage, but my mother always warned me not to touch the handle. Said bad things lived in locked rooms." Before Clara could press further, the auctioneer's voice rose again, commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, Lot 7, exclusive bidding for the estate itself. The Tmont property, in its entirety. Starting bid, 50,000. A ripple of excitement ran through the crowd. This was what they had come for. Hands shot up with paddles, and the bidding leapt quickly, 60, 70, 80. Clara scanned the faces. She noticed a man in a gray suit who had stood silent through the earlier lots. He was tall, clean-cut, with the calm demeanor of someone who didn't need to prove himself. When the price hit 100,000, his paddle lifted, steady and unshaken. Whispers followed. "That's Michael Calder, big developer out of the city. He's been buying up half the town. Probably going to gut the place and turn it into condos." But Calder wasn't the only determined bidder. A local antiques dealer, jittery and sweating, pushed back at every raise. His hands shook as if he were desperate, not just eager. Clara studied him. His eyes darted not to the walls or the roof but toward the upstairs windows, the very ones that overlooked the locked room. The bidding war grew fierce, voices rising with each new number. Finally, when the figure crossed 200,000, the antique dealer slumped in defeat, lowering his paddle. Calder stood alone, calm, as if he had expected victory from the start. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, his gavel slamming down. "To Michael Calder." Applause scattered through the crowd. Calder gave a polite nod, then disappeared into the house with the bank representative, likely to finalize paperwork. Clara didn't clap. Her instincts hummed. Why had that dealer looked so desperate? What secret could possibly be worth risking financial ruin for? She slipped through the dispersing crowd until she caught up with the man, who was shoving papers angrily into his satchel. "Rough loss," Clara said casually. He flinched, eyes narrowing. "What's it to you?" "Detective Clara Dane, Harlow Police." She showed her badge. "I couldn't help noticing how much you wanted this place." The man swallowed hard. His lips trembled as though he wanted to speak but feared the words themselves. Finally, he muttered, Some houses aren't just wood and stone. They keep things people don't want found." "Like what?" Clara pressed. He glanced toward the estate, where Calder's silhouette passed across the upstairs windows. "I've heard stories for years. Whispers about that locked room. The Tremonts weren't just rich, they were involved in things. Deals. Rituals. They buried more than one secret in those walls. I wanted to be the one to dig it up before it rotted entirely." Clara's pulse quickened. "And now Calder owns it." The man nodded, his voice dropping. "Be careful, detective. Some people buy houses for the land. Others buy them for what's inside." Before she could ask more, he pushed past her and vanished into the crowd, leaving only unease behind. By the time the sun dipped behind the estate's roofline, most of the auction-goers had departed. Only a few lingered, waiting for pickup trucks to load furniture. Clara lingered too, scanning the house. A shadow shifted against one of the upstairs windows, the locked room. For a moment, she thought she saw a face watching her, pale and expressionless. When she blinked, it was gone. But one thing was certain, the Tmont estate had not finished speaking. And whatever story it held in its locked walls, Calder had just bought the right to uncover it. Clara knew she couldn't wait for him to dig on his own terms. She would have to step back into the estate soon, not as a witness to an auction, but as a detective chasing whispers that refused to stay buried. The house had been sold, but its secrets were still very much alive. And now, someone had paid dearly to own them. The house on Hawthorne Street had been empty for years, its windows nailed shut, its garden swallowed by ivy, its roof sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. To most, it was nothing but another abandoned property in a neighborhood where houses went to die. But for Detective Marcus Hale, the house was more than an eyesore, it was a puzzle piece. He stood in front of the chained gate, squinting through the overgrowth. The house had come up twice now in interviews with different people. First, in the whispered recollections of a retired mailman who remembered strange packages arriving there years ago. Second, in the fragmented story of a woman who swore she saw a man dragging a trunk through the side door late at night. Different witnesses. Different times. The same house. Marcus unclipped the chain and pushed the gate open. The air smelled of rot and rust, and the sound of his boots crunching the gravel echoed unnaturally. He paused, scanning the boarded-up facade. Something about the place gave him the uncanny sensation that it was watching him. "Creepy as hell," muttered Detective Reyes behind him, his younger partner who always masked nerves with sarcasm. "Stay sharp," Marcus replied. "If half of what we've heard is true, this isn't just an abandoned house." They circled to the back, where a basement window had been pried open. A draft seeped out, carrying the unmistakable odor of mildew, and something else, something metallic. Blood had a smell you never forgot. Marcus drew in a breath and signaled Reyes to follow. The basement stairs groaned as they descended into the darkness. Their flashlights cut through cobwebs, dust motes swirling like disturbed ghosts. The beam caught rows of shelves stacked against the wall, cluttered with old books, cracked picture frames, and jars of cloudy liquid. But it wasn't the clutter that made Marcus's skin crawl. It was the arrangement. Everything was meticulously organized, labeled in handwriting that leaned sharp and deliberate. And then he saw the mannequin. At the far end of the basement stood a human-shaped form draped in faded clothing, its blank plastic face staring at them. In its hands, it clutched a child's stuffed rabbit, the kind sold in department stores decades ago. Reyes swore under his breath. "Jesus Hale, what the hell is this place?" Marcus stepped closer, shining his light along the walls. More mannequins appeared from the shadows, each posed differently, each dressed in clothing that looked lived in, stained shoes, worn coats, even jewelry still dangling from wrists and necks. It wasn't random. It was a collection. And then Marcus noticed the tags. Every mannequin bore a small tag tied with string around its wrist. Each one had a name, written neatly in ink. Elaine M. June 1987. Thomas R. March 1991. Nora S. September 1994. The dates stretched across decades. Marcus's stomach turned cold. "These aren't mannequins," he said quietly. "They're stand-ins. For the real people," Reyes finished, his voice barely above a whisper. The stuffed rabbit in the mannequin's hands wasn't random either. Marcus remembered the case file from years ago. Elaine Markham, a missing 9-year-old girl who vanished in 1987, last seen with her favorite toy. Suddenly, the house wasn't just creepy. It was a tomb. The next day, the forensics team combed through every inch of the house. Marcus and Reyes watched as evidence bags filled with hair strands, fabric fibers, and handwritten journals pulled from a locked cabinet. The journals were thick, leather-bound, and cataloged like an obsessive librarian's archive. Inside, the entries were detailed, clinical, and deeply disturbing. Each victim was given a page, or in some cases, several pages, documenting their appearance, their habits, the day they vanished, and most chilling of all, how they were preserved in memory. The writer referred to himself only as the collector. Marcus flipped through one entry that made his stomach knot. Elaine M. Her laughter echoes still. She tried to run, but the swing creaked too loud. The rabbit must stay with her, for it holds her scent. Another entry read, Thomas R., proud boy, too sure of himself. I took his jacket so he would not forget where he belonged. They all forget. But I remember for them. It was clear the collector wasn't just a killer. He was an archivist of lives he had stolen, each one catalogued and remembered in his grotesque way. Back at the precinct, Marcus gathered the team. This man isn't impulsive, he said, spreading photos across the table. He's ritualistic. He collects, he documents, and he recreates. Every detail matters to him. That means he's careful, and careful killers don't just stop. Reyes leaned back in his chair. So he's still out there. Unless we're looking at a graveyard that hasn't been discovered yet, Marcus said grimly. The realization was suffocating. If the collector had been active since at least the late 80s, that meant decades of victims, decades of families who never knew what happened. And now the house was a map of his horrors. 3 nights later, Marcus found himself staring at his kitchen wall, unable to sleep. He kept seeing the mannequins, their lifeless eyes fixed in eternal poses. He kept hearing the words of the journal, they all forget. But I remember for them. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey, but before he could pour, his phone buzzed. It was Reyes. You're going to want to hear this, Reyes said, his voice tight. Lab found something. One of the hair samples doesn't match any of the old cases. It's recent, like within the last year. Marcus froze. You're saying the collector is still active? More than that, Reyes replied. He has a new victim. And this one isn't in the journals we recovered. Marcus set down the bottle and grabbed his coat. The collector wasn't just a ghost from the past. He was still out there, adding to his archive. When Marcus returned to the evidence board at the precinct, his eyes locked on the photographs of the mannequins, the journals, the names spanning decades. One question burned in his mind now, sharper than ever. If the collector was still active, then who was his latest acquisition? And more importantly, where was he keeping them? The mannequins weren't just trophies. They were placeholders, representations of people taken and lost. But the latest victim hadn't yet been given a mannequin. That meant somewhere out there, someone was alive, trapped, waiting, perhaps praying to become just another tag in the collector's morbid gallery. Marcus clenched his fists. He had seen killers with patterns before, but never one who curated lives like an art collection. If they didn't stop him now, the collector would simply keep adding to his archive, one name at a time. And Marcus knew one thing with certainty. The collector wasn't finished. Not yet. The whisper of damp air carried through the abandoned farmhouse as Detective Marissa Hale and her partner, Detective Aaron Cross, moved deeper into its hollow body. Dust spiraled up under the beams of their flashlights. The boards moaned under their weight, as if the house itself resented intruders disturbing its long silence. The farmhouse had belonged to Henry Caldwell, a reclusive antiques dealer known around town for buying up estate sales and hoarding treasures in his crumbling rural property. When Caldwell was found dead in his armchair 3 weeks earlier, an apparent suicide, no one thought much of it. He was old, lived alone, and had been in poor health. But as the detectives investigated the string of disappearances that had begun to plague the town, 2 young women and 1 man missing over the course of 6 months, Caldwell's name had surfaced again and again. A receipt from one of the missing women's belongings led them to him. She had sold him a family heirloom, an ornate pocket watch. Yet when the detectives searched Caldwell's official inventory, the watch was absent. It was as if he had been keeping secrets, just like the farmhouse seemed to keep its own. "Place is a maze," Aaron muttered, brushing a cobweb from his sleeve as they stepped into what must have once been the pantry. The air was stale, rank with mildew. Marissa's eyes scanned the floorboards. Henry Caldwell didn't let anyone in here. His nephew said he locked every door himself. That means he didn't want anything stolen or found. Their flashlights caught the glint of metal in the far corner. A large, antique armoire leaned against the wall, one door slightly ajar. It looked too heavy to have been moved in decades. Marissa approached, tugging it open. The hinges screamed in protest. Behind it was a door. Narrow, but unpainted. The kind of door you'd never notice unless you looked for it. Aaron stepped forward, jaw tightening. Well, what are you hiding, Henry? The detectives exchanged a glance. With effort, Aaron pulled the armoire aside, sending a cascade of dust into the air. The door waited, its knob rusted, its edges sealed with a strip of warped wood nailed into the frame, as if Caldwell had wanted to make sure it never opened again. Marissa produced a pry bar from her bag and wedged it beneath the strip. The nails groaned, popped, and finally gave way. She pushed the door, but it resisted, swollen with years of neglect. With Aaron's shoulder bracing against it, the wood shuddered and gave way, swinging inward into darkness. A rush of colder air spilled out. The beam of Marissa's flashlight cut through it, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down. "Basement," Aaron muttered. "But why lock it up like this?" Marissa's gut twisted. Because whatever's down there wasn't meant to be found. The descent. The stairs creaked under their boots, each step sinking slightly under weight. The smell grew stronger, something sour, metallic, and long-trapped. As they descended, the walls closed in. The staircase was narrow, the concrete walls rough and damp. At the bottom, the passage opened into a low-ceilinged room. The light fell across shelves, dozens of them, lined with objects wrapped in muslin cloth. Each was labeled with neat handwriting, a system of dates and initials. Marissa pulled one down, unwrapping it carefully. Inside was a child's porcelain doll, its eyes clouded with cracks. The tag read, 1998. Her chest tightened. "These aren't antiques," she whispered. Aaron examined another, unwrapping a silver locket. Inside was the faded photograph of a teenage girl. The initials scratched onto the tag matched one of the missing person cases from years ago, a girl who'd disappeared walking home from school. He swore under his breath. "This isn't collecting. It's trophies." The hidden journal. At the center of the room was a desk. On it lay a thick leather-bound book, its cover cracked, its edges stained. Marissa opened it, the brittle pages whispering as they turned. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. Each entry listed a name, a description, a date. Some entries were only a line or two. Others sprawled across several pages. "Margaret L. She sold me her grandmother's brooch. She smiled when I gave her the money. She trusts too easily. They all do. The doll was too precious to her. She cried when I said I'd buy it. I couldn't let her keep it. I had to keep her too." The words blurred as Marissa read. Her throat tightened. Each entry detailed not just the purchase of some heirloom, but what Caldwell had done afterward. How he had lured them in. How he had kept them. How he had ended them. Aaron's face paled. "Jesus, Marissa. This guy wasn't just an old hoarder. He was a serial killer." And worse, the last entry wasn't dated years ago. It was dated only 2 months earlier. The hidden room beyond. At the far end of the basement, partially obscured by shelves, was another door. This one was steel, bolted from the outside. Fresh scrape marks suggested it had been opened recently. Marissa's pulse quickened. She grabbed the handle and pulled. The door opened onto a smaller room, bare except for a cot, a bucket, and chains bolted into the wall. The shackles still held scraps of torn fabric. The walls were carved with scratches, desperate lines overlapping each other. Some formed words. "Help me. Please. Not my watch." Aaron's jaw clenched. He was keeping them alive down here. Marissa turned away, bile rising in her throat. And no one ever came looking. But her flashlight landed on something in the corner. A shoe. Well, modern. Too new to have belonged to someone from years ago. She crouched, lifting it. Her stomach sank. It matched the description of what one of the recent missing girls, Sophie Kendall, had been wearing the night she vanished. Aaron's eyes widened. "You don't think?" Marissa scanned the walls, the cot, the chains. The room was empty. But Sophie had been here. Recently. Either she's still alive, Marissa said, voice trembling, or he passed her off to someone else before he died. The collector's legacy. The detective spent hours documenting everything. The shelves of trophies, the journal entries, the prison-like room. But as the evidence piled up, so did the questions. If Henry Caldwell had been the collector all along, how many people had he taken? How many families had mourned without answers while he sat quietly in his farmhouse, surrounded by their memories? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, if Sophie had been here and Caldwell was now dead, who had taken her away? Because the final page of his journal didn't read like an ending. It read like a handoff. "Sophie is too spirited. She does not belong in my collection. But she belongs somewhere. He will come for her. He always does." Marissa slammed the book shut, her heart pounding. "He who?" Aaron shook his head, eyes narrowing. Caldwell wasn't working alone. As they emerged from the farmhouse that night, the air outside felt no cleaner, no freer. The crickets chirped. The moonlight stretched across the fields. But Marissa felt a weight pressing on her chest. Henry Caldwell might be dead, but his secrets weren't buried with him. The hidden room had given up its ghosts, but it had also whispered a new terror. Somewhere out there was another collector. Someone who had continued the legacy. Someone who still had Sophie. And maybe, just maybe, Caldwell had only ever been the apprentice. The brass key lay in Detective Marlowe's palm, heavier than it should have been, as though it carried more than metal inside. Something invisible, something restless. Its teeth were jagged, mismatched, and along the shaft, shallow grooves had been etched. They weren't scratches from wear. They were deliberate carvings, symbols or letters pressed into the surface by someone who had meant for them to remain secret. Marlowe turned it under the yellow glow of the precinct's desk lamp. The grooves seemed to shimmer as though whispering to him in the silence of his office. He had already shown it to the forensics lab. No match. No standard cut pattern. Not to a house, not to a locker, not to a safe deposit box. It was custom, hand-filed. It could open just one door in the world. And Marlowe had the feeling that finding that door would either solve everything or end him. The night whispers. That night, as the city outside seemed to exhale into darkness, Marlowe sat back in his chair and closed his eyes, the key dangling from a chain in his hand. He hadn't noticed it before, but when the room was quiet enough, he could swear he heard something faint, like a breath pushing through a crack in the wall. A whisper. At first, he dismissed it as fatigue. He'd been living on black coffee and cigarettes, his mind blurring the line between sound and imagination. But when he pressed the key against his ear, the whisper grew stronger. A hiss of words he couldn't fully form. "Fine, you would listen." His hand froze. His eyes snapped open. He stared at the key, then shoved it back into his pocket like it was cursed. He didn't believe in ghosts, in haunted objects, or in whispers from the other side. But he believed in criminals, in obsession, and in people who left trails. If someone had carved a message into the grooves of a key, maybe, just maybe, they wanted it to speak. The locksmith. By morning, Marlowe had tracked down Elijah Crane, a locksmith known not only for his skill but for his eccentricities. Crane's shop smelled of metal shavings, oil, and dust. Keys hung on rows of hooks, thousands of them, like a metallic forest. "This isn't just a key," Crane muttered when Marlowe placed it in his hand. The old man turned it slowly, his jeweler's glass pressed to one eye. "It's a cipher." "A cipher?" Crane pointed to the grooves. "These aren't random. They're a code. Whoever made this wasn't just opening a door. They were writing something. Marlowe leaned forward. Can you read it? Crane chuckled, his teeth yellow and sharp. Keys don't talk. They sing. But you gotta know the tune. He pulled a piece of graphite paper, pressed the key into it, and rolled it gently. The markings transferred onto the page. Lines, notches, and strange shapes. Side by side, they looked almost like letters. Not English. Not anything Marlowe recognized. Crane squinted. I've seen something like this before, old ciphers, wartime stuff, secret societies. Whoever made this key was clever. They wanted to hide their map in plain sight. Marlowe asked the question that had been burning inside him since the collector's name first surfaced. Where does it lead? Crane shook his head. That depends. But it won't be anywhere you want to go. A house with no address. That night, Marlowe followed his gut. He retraced the last known locations connected to the collector. The abandoned estate where the locked room was discovered, the old auction house where rare items were whispered about in dark corners. He kept the key close, pressing it against surfaces, half mocking himself, half terrified that something would respond. And then, just past midnight, he found himself in front of a house that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't on any street map. No house number. Just a sagging structure crouched between two modern buildings like it had been forgotten by time. Its windows were blacked out, boards nailed across. The air smelled damp, metallic, like the inside of a cellar. And yet, Marlowe felt pulled toward it. The key in his pocket grew warm. He stood on the steps, pulled it out, and raised it to the front door. The lock wasn't ordinary. It was a jagged, twisted slot, unlike anything he'd ever seen. And yet, the key fit perfectly. His hand trembled as he turned it. The door unlocked with a low groan, almost like a sigh of relief. Inside, the house was silent. Too silent. No creaks of settling wood, no scurrying of mice, no hum of outside traffic. Just silence thick enough to choke on. The beam of Marlowe's flashlight swept across the foyer. Covered furniture. And yet, everything was arranged meticulously, like the house wasn't abandoned, but waiting. On the far wall, words had been scrawled in chalk. Every key remembers its lock. Marlowe's stomach tightened. Room by room, he moved through the house. Each door opened with ease, until he reached the second floor. At the end of a narrow hallway, there was another door. This one had no knob, no lock, just a smooth wooden surface. But when Marlowe pressed his ear against it, he swore he heard breathing. He pulled the whispering key from his pocket. It didn't fit. He tried again, forcing it, until he realized this wasn't its door. The key had led him here, but not to this. The basement. Downstairs, behind a shelf lined with cracked jars, Marlowe found another door. Sunken, as though built for someone to crawl through. The lock was strange, angular. He slid the key in. The door swung open. A cold rush of air flooded out, carrying with it the faintest sound. A whisper. Marlowe. He froze. His light caught the top of a staircase that descended into absolute blackness. Step by step, he went down. The walls narrowed, damp and rough. His flashlight beam caught carvings etched into the stone. Keys, hundreds of them, drawn over and over. Some crude, some detailed, like a shrine to locks. At the bottom, the passage opened into a chamber. And in the center of the chamber was a table. On it sat a journal. The cover was leather, cracked, but the symbol carved into it was unmistakable. The same etching from the key. The journal. Marlowe's hands trembled as he opened it. Pages of sketches. Drawings of keys. Maps of locks. Notes scribbled in a language only half decipherable. But among them were words he understood. Names, dates, addresses. And at the bottom of one page, a list. Not objects. Not artifacts. People. Victims, their names catalogued like inventory. Each with a date beside them, the date of their disappearance. And next to some, a crude drawing of a key. Each person had been turned into a key. Marlowe stared in horror as the whispers grew louder. They weren't coming from the air. They were coming from the journal itself, voices layered over each other, trapped inside ink and paper. And then one whisper cut through the rest. Detective Marlowe. You're already on the list. His blood turned cold. The page fluttered as though moved by a breath. There was his name, scribbled in the same jagged hand. No date yet, but the key in his hand suddenly felt heavier, as though it was waiting. Marlowe snapped the journal shut and shoved it into his coat. He stumbled up the stairs, through the house, and out into the night air. He didn't lock the door behind him. He couldn't, because he knew the house wasn't meant to keep people out. It was meant to keep something in. And the key had just let it loose. Detective Helena Cross sat at her desk, the whispering key lying flat on a square of felt, as though it were both a sacred relic and a ticking bomb. The brass glimmered faintly under the fluorescent light, the faint etchings along its shaft catching shadows. The phrase that had been repeating in her head since she discovered it returned again. Keys do not open doors, they reveal secrets. It had been carved into the spine of the black journal she had unearthed from the hidden room. A journal that had belonged to Walter Gray, the eccentric locksmith who, decades earlier, had built the strange maze of locks and puzzles throughout his sprawling estate. And if Gray's writing could be believed, the key in front of her was only one of many. The journal. The leather-bound journal smelled of mold and ash, the pages brittle but legible. Helena flipped through them again, her pen scratching notes in the margins of her own case file. The entries were rambling, uneven, written by a man teetering between genius and madness. One section in particular chilled her. I have forged 13. Each whispers when the silence is right. Not to doors, no, they do not care for doors. They are maps, each leading to a memory I dared not destroy. A secret preserved in brass. Should one key fall into the wrong hands, the rest must remain hidden. Legacy is a burden. 13 keys. 13 secrets. Helena's stomach tightened. She had only one. That meant 12 were still missing. The next entries became increasingly cryptic. He wrote about voices in the walls, about rooms that reshape themselves when the proper key is turned. He mentioned names, people in town who had wronged him, debts unpaid, betrayals unpunished. The journal hinted that Gray had left behind something more than eccentric puzzles. He had left a reckoning. The locksmith's house. By late afternoon, Helena drove back to the old Gray estate. Its sagging silhouette loomed against a slate-gray sky. The house had already given her one hidden room, but if Gray's words were true, there were more, an entire labyrinth of secrets. She stepped inside, flashlight beams sweeping across dust and cobwebs. The air smelled stale, a cocktail of mildew and old wood. The key in her pocket felt heavy, like it wanted to be used. She paused at the foot of the main staircase. On the far wall, a large grandfather clock stood motionless, its pendulum still. For some reason, her eyes fixed on it. She pulled out the whispering key, raised it, and pressed it against the ornate brass keyhole on the clock's face. The lock yielded immediately. The entire face of the clock swung outward like a door, revealing a narrow passage behind it. Helena exhaled slowly. Gray had hidden another room. The passage. The air in the passage was cooler, damp, like a cellar. Wooden steps descended into a cramped corridor lined with shelves. On the shelves sat boxes, dozens of them, each marked with a number burned into the wood. She pulled one down. Inside lay a velvet pouch. Opening it, she found another key, smaller than the first, but etched with the same faint, swirling designs. Box number 4. Key number 4. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't just a theory. The journal had been right. At the end of the corridor, she found a door. It was unlike any she had seen in the house before, smooth, seamless, as though it had grown into the wall itself. No knob. Only a keyhole. Helena tried the second key. The teeth slid in smoothly, but when she turned it, the mechanism inside growled, then stopped. Not the right key for this door. Still, she knew one thing. Gray had left her a trail, and she had only just started down it. Gray's descendants. Back at the precinct, Helena began digging into Walter Gray's family. Gray himself had died mysteriously in 1972, his body found slumped over his workbench, his chest scarred by what the coroner described as a sudden cardiac rupture. He had left no direct heirs, at least, not officially. But Helena found something odd in the probate records. A series of property transfers, small parcels of land on the edge of town, sold off quietly over the years. The recipients had different names, but the handwriting on the deeds matched Gray's. He had given away pieces of his estate. But why? One name kept repeating: Thomas Keene. Helena froze. Keene was the name of the antiques dealer she had seen at the auction, the man who had seemed too eager, too knowledgeable about Gray's keys. If Gray had trusted him, or at least dealt with him, then Keene knew far more than he had let on. The dealer's confession. That evening, Helena visited Keene's shop. It was after hours, the glass door locked, but the lights still burned inside. Through the window, she saw Keene hunched over a desk, a magnifying glass in hand, studying what looked like another brass key. Helena knocked sharply. Keene jumped, nearly dropping the key. His face paled when he recognized her. "You found one, didn't you?" he whispered as he opened the door. "More than one," Helena replied. "And I know you're holding another." Keene swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the shelves. Finally, he sighed and gestured for her to follow. In the back room, he opened a locked cabinet and withdrew a small case. Inside was a key, key number 7, engraved in the same swirling designs. "I didn't steal it," he said quickly. "Gray gave it to me. Said one day, someone would come looking. He wanted me to keep it safe." "Why you?" Helena asked. Keene looked down at his trembling hands. "Because I'm his grandson." Helena blinked. Gray had no family. "Not legally," Keene said bitterly. "My mother was his daughter. He never acknowledged her. But when she died, he came for me, raised me for a while, taught me his craft. Then one day, he vanished into his own madness. But he trusted me with the 7th key." Helena studied him. He wasn't lying. She could see the raw truth in his eyes. "What do they unlock?" she asked. Keene hesitated. Then he said, "Not what? Who? Legacy of the keys." The words hung heavy in the air. Gray believed memories could be stored, Keene continued. Not in photographs or letters, but in places. In spaces. He called them his memory rooms. Each key opens one. And inside is a truth he wanted remembered. Some are personal. Others are dangerous. And some, he swallowed, are meant as punishment. Helena thought of the hidden room with the journal, the whispering walls, the unfinished mechanisms. If what Keene said was true, Gray hadn't been a mad eccentric. He had been a man building a legacy of secrets, each one locked in brass. "How many keys do you have?" Helena asked. "Only this one," Keene said. "But I know others are out there. Scattered. Some sold at auctions, some hidden in walls. Gray wanted them to be found, but not too easily." Helena leaned forward. "Then why were you at the auction? You weren't protecting his secrets. You were trying to collect them." Keene's jaw tightened. "Because someone else is looking detective. Someone dangerous. And if they gather all 13 first, God help us." "The shadow collector." Helena's pulse quickened. "Who?" Keene shook his head. "I don't know their name. Only that they call themselves the collector. They've been buying up Gray's artifacts, outbidding anyone who gets close. I've lost 3 keys to them already." The collector. The words echoed in Helena's mind like a warning bell. Keene placed the 7th key into her hand. "Take it. Gray would have wanted you to. But be careful. If you have 2 keys already, they'll come for you next." The keeper's warning. Back in her car, Helena studied the 2nd and 7th keys side by side. They looked almost identical, save for their size and number. She could feel their weight, hear the faint hum when she held them together. The journal's words returned. "Legacy is a burden." Gray had left behind more than puzzles. He had left a curse, a chain of secrets that refused to stay buried. And now, Helena was entangled in it, hunted by someone who wanted the keys for reasons she could only imagine. As she drove back toward the Gray estate, the sky cracked open with thunder. She knew she couldn't stop now. The rooms, the keys, the collector, every piece was part of a larger design. Walter Gray had not just been a locksmith. He had been an architect of truths, hiding them in brass and wood, waiting for someone brave, or foolish, enough to inherit them. and Helena Cross was now the keeper of that legacy. But in the shadows, she could almost feel another set of eyes. Watching. Waiting. The collector had already marked her. Detective Reeves had always prided himself on logic. On patterns. On the belief that every crime, no matter how brutal or bizarre, followed a trail that could be traced if one only looked hard enough. But the Keymaker's case, what the press now called the Collector murders, was rapidly shattering the framework he built his career upon. Because there was no trail. There was only shadow. And yet, as he sat alone in his car outside the Bramhall estate at 3 a.m., rain streaking the windshield in trembling rivulets, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was watching him. The phantom presence. The discovery of the hidden room weeks earlier had shifted the investigation from peculiar to unholy. Inside had been artifacts, diaries, sketches, photographs of victims taken in their final moments, all catalogued with an obsession that bordered on ritual. The man Reeves and Detective Vance had come to know only as the collector had lived among them like a ghost, recording, preserving, and orchestrating a theater of death. And still, no one had seen him. Reeves drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, staring at the dark silhouette of the mansion. The whispering key, the secret room, the legacy of the long-dead keymaker, all of it pointed to something that wasn't finished. Everything you find, Vance had said the night before, feels like it's already been staged for us. Like we're supposed to walk into it. Like he's guiding us. Reeves hadn't answered then, but now, in the stormy silence of his car, he admitted to himself that she was right. This wasn't a killer hiding. This was a killer performing. The next morning, Reeves arrived at the precinct to find Vance pale, leaning against her desk with a small cardboard box at her feet. "They were waiting for me," she said quietly. Inside the box were 6 VHS tapes. Each was labeled with a victim's name in shaky handwriting. And one more at the bottom, scrawled with fresh ink, Detective Reeves. Reeves felt the air leave his lungs as he lifted it. The tape was warm, as if it had only recently been made. They crowded into the media room and fed the first tape into the player. Grainy footage flickered to life. A woman sat in a dimly lit chair, wrists bound. She looked directly into the camera. "Please," she whispered. "Please, I just want to go home." Her voice broke as a shadow passed over the frame. The screen cut to static. Every tape was like that. A different victim. A different chair. A different plea that ended in silence. And then came his tape. Reeves' heart hammered as the footage filled the screen. It showed his apartment. His couch, his lamp, his stack of case files. The camera panned slowly toward the window where rain tapped against the glass. And then, from behind the camera, a voice rasped. "Detective Reeves, you've been looking in the wrong rooms." The tape ended. Fractures. Afterward, the precinct fell into uneasy quiet. Some detectives muttered about leaks, about someone feeding the killer inside information. Others accused Reeves directly. Was it possible he was being manipulated, led astray by obsession? Reeves himself wasn't sure anymore. That night, he sat in his apartment, every light turned on, staring at the window shown in the tape. He traced the reflection of the glass, convinced he could feel fingerprints on it, even though it looked clean. His phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Look beneath the key. Midnight." No address. No signature. Reeves stared at it for a long time, his chest tightening. He thought of the whispering key still locked in evidence, the one they had pulled from the Bramhall estate. He thought of the keymaker's strange obsession with doors, locks, and hidden rooms. And he knew he couldn't ignore it. At 11:55 p.m., Reeves was outside the Bramhall estate once again, flashlight in hand, key in pocket. The rain had cleared, leaving the air wet and heavy, like the house itself was breathing. He made his way down to the basement, to the old workbench where the whispering key had first been found. The text had said, "Look beneath the key." He crouched low, running his fingers along the underside of the wooden bench. A hollow click. A panel shifted, and a small drawer slid open. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed, the ink faded but legible. The keymaker's journal. He flipped it open, scanning the words, each sentence stranger than the last. The locks must remain closed, for only the collector holds the shadow. Each soul I keep is not mine, but his. He comes for me in the mirror, and I must obey. Reeves' pulse quickened. This wasn't just some eccentric craftsman. The keymaker hadn't been working alone. He'd been in service to something, or someone, that demanded tribute. And as he turned the final page, Reeves froze. Because there, drawn in delicate ink, was his own face. The shadow moves. A creak sounded behind him. Reeves spun, flashlight beam cutting across the dark basement. At the far end of the room stood a figure. Tall, motionless, dressed in black. The beam caught just enough to glint off the edge of a mask. A smooth porcelain mask with no features except for two hollow eyes. The collector. For a long moment, neither moved. The air between them seemed to hum. Then, without a word, the figure raised a gloved hand and tapped something against the wall. A key. The sound echoed through the basement like a gunshot. And then, as Reeves blinked, the figure was gone. The paranoia. The following days blurred together. Reeves could no longer tell if he was being hunted or manipulated. The collector had been there, he was certain of it. But Vance and the others found no footprints, no trace, nothing but the journal Reeves swore he hadn't imagined. Yet when they examined it in daylight, the last page, the one with his face, was blank. "You need sleep, Reeves," Vance told him gently. "You're seeing what he wants you to see." But Reeves wasn't so sure. Because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the mask. He heard the tap of the key against stone. And worse, he began noticing things in his apartment out of place. A chair slightly moved. A clock reset. Once, his door unlocked even though he was certain he had bolted it. The collector wasn't just shadow anymore. He was inside. The collector's shadow. On the 7th night since the journal, Reeves awoke to silence. No hum of the refrigerator. No city noise through the window. Just silence, thick and heavy. And then he heard it. A whisper. "Detective." He sat up in bed, reaching for his gun. The whisper seemed to seep from the walls themselves, low and dragging, like someone breathing through a locked door. "Come and see." He followed it into his living room, gun raised, every nerve taut. And there, on his coffee table, lay a single object that hadn't been there before. A key. This one unlike the others, black, polished, its teeth jagged like broken glass. And beneath it, a note in the same shaky handwriting as the tapes. "The shadow is yours now." Reeves' hand trembled as he reached for it. Because deep down, beneath the fear, he already knew the truth. The collector wasn't just hunting victims. He was choosing a successor. And somehow, impossibly, the shadow had chosen him. The storm that had rolled in overnight had left the estate cloaked in mist the next morning. Rainwater still trickled down the old gutters, dripping like a metronome against the stone steps as Detective Hale and Clara crossed the threshold of the Hawthorne mansion once more. The air inside was damp, heavy with that mingling of mildew and age that seemed to seep through every corner of the house. But this time, something was different. Something in the atmosphere felt charged, almost expectant. Clara carried the brass key she'd inherited from her grandfather's desk, the one that had been marked with a strange sigil on its bow, a symbol shaped like a jagged eye. She kept it wrapped in a cloth, afraid to touch the cold metal directly. Hale had insisted they bring it, though he admitted that he wasn't sure whether it was evidence or bait. "Feels like we're walking straight into the belly of the beast," Hale muttered as they reached the grand hall. Clara's eyes flicked upward to the staircase, remembering the whisper that had seemed to follow her up there days earlier. "The key opens more than doors." She shivered and tightened her grip on the bundle. Their destination lay deep within the east wing of the house, the part that had been cordoned off by plywood and warning tape during the initial search. Behind a collapsed bookcase, they had found a narrow corridor, its wallpaper peeling in long curls, leading toward what looked like a blocked-off wall. But Hale had noticed something odd. Faint draft lines across the plaster, as if the wall was hollow. And Clara had remembered the key, which her grandfather once called the family's inheritance. When they reached the end of the corridor, Clara's breath caught. The wall wasn't just plaster. It was covered in cracked silvered panels, fragments of old mirrors patched together in an uneven mosaic. Some were clouded with age, others splintered so that they distorted their reflections. Hale's face appeared broken into jagged pieces, his eyes multiplied, his jaw bent at unnatural angles. Clara refused to look too long, afraid she might see something standing behind her instead. "This is it," Hale said grimly. "The mirror door." He pressed his palm against the surface, but it didn't budge. No seam, no hinges, no lock, just the unsettling collage of reflections. Clara, her fingers trembling, unwrapped the brass key. The sigil seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, as if aware of its purpose. "What if it's not meant to be opened?" Clara whispered. Hale gave her a sharp look. "Then why hide it?" She hesitated, then pressed the key against one of the mirror shards. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a breath being drawn through glass, the surface rippled. The mirrors shifted, rearranging themselves as though sliding over invisible hinges, until an opening appeared. A narrow passage yawned before them, pitch black. The temperature dropped instantly. Clara's breath came out in pale clouds. Hale took out his flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark. "Stay close," he murmured. The passage stretched deeper than the house should allow. The walls were lined with more mirrors, but these were polished and intact, each reflecting not their present selves but strange scenes. Clara caught glimpses of rooms she had never seen before. A parlor filled with strangers dressed in old-fashioned morning clothes, a dining hall with a long table set for a feast where no one sat, a nursery where a cradle rocked though no child was inside. She couldn't tear her gaze away. "Hale, these aren't just reflections." "I know," he said tensely. "Don't get distracted." They reached a chamber at the end of the corridor. It was circular, the walls entirely mirrored, so that it felt like they were standing inside an infinite repetition of themselves. But at the center of the floor lay a wooden chest, bound with iron straps, its lid carved with the same jagged eye sigil. Clara's chest tightened. "That's the mark. The one my grandfather used." Hale circled the chest cautiously, his reflection multiplying with each step. "Looks like the family wasn't just hoarding paintings. This is older, ritualistic." When Clara bent to touch the chest, a whisper filled the chamber, not in her ears, but inside her skull. "The key belongs to the blood. The blood belongs to the door." She recoiled, her hands clutching her temples. "Did you hear that?" Hale's jaw hardened. "No, but I've seen this before. Survivors in cult cases, auditory hallucinations, triggered by symbols or objects. Your grandfather's people may have been deeper in this than you realized." Clara's voice shook. "He always said the key wasn't just a key. He said it was a responsibility." "Open it," Hale said firmly. Her fingers fumbled as she slid the brass key into the iron lock. The chest gave way with a groan, as though resisting. Inside lay a stack of journals, their leather covers worn and stained. On top rested an object that made Clara gasp, a mask made entirely of polished mirror shards, bound together with wire. Its eye holes were cut in jagged ovals, its mouth a thin slit. Hale didn't touch it. Instead, he picked up one of the journals and flipped it open. The ink inside was spidery, barely legible, but the words were enough to freeze them both. "The collector watches from the other side. Each offering opens another door. The mirrors remember." Hale shut the book abruptly. His eyes darted to the mirrored walls, where his own reflection now seemed to lag behind his movements. For a fraction of a second, Clara swore she saw Hale's double staring back at her, but its mouth curved into a smile he hadn't made. She dropped the key in panic. It clanged against the floor, and the mirrored mask slid forward as if nudged by unseen hands. The chamber filled with a faint sound, scraping, scratching, like nails against glass. "Clara, we're leaving." "Now," Hale ordered, his voice sharper than she'd ever heard it. They turned to the corridor, but the path behind them had shifted. Instead of the narrow passage, there was another wall of mirrors, this one reflecting only darkness. Hale swung his flashlight wildly, looking for a seam, a crack, anything. Clara, meanwhile, couldn't stop staring at her own reflection. It wasn't moving. Her mirrored self stood still, its eyes unblinking, its mouth slightly parted as though whispering. And then, it reached out. The glass rippled as her reflection pressed its palm against the barrier. Clara stumbled back, colliding with Hale. What the hell? The mirrored chamber trembled. The journals rustled, their pages fluttering though there was no wind. The mask rolled onto the floor, landing upright as though waiting to be worn. Clara's grandfather's words rang in her memory. The key is only part of the inheritance. The rest is choice. Her reflection was still watching her, lips forming silent words she couldn't quite hear. Hale gripped her arm. Don't look at it. Don't listen. But Clara's eyes locked onto the mirror door that had brought them here. The jagged eye symbol glowed faintly across its surface. She realized with a jolt of terror that the door wasn't just a way in, it was also a way out. But only if the right offering was made. The scratching sound grew louder. The mirrored chamber seemed alive, breathing, pulsing. Hale shouted something. She couldn't hear him over the cacophony. All she could hear was the whisper inside her skull. The blood belongs to the door. Clara clutched the brass key until its edges bit into her skin. She felt warmth drip down her palm, blood. As the drops hit the mirrored floor, the jagged eye sigil pulsed brighter, the mirrors trembling like water. The passage behind them snapped open again, the corridor revealed as if by mercy. Hale grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the chest, the mask, the reflections that didn't belong to them. They stumbled out into the hallway, collapsing against the rotten wallpaper. The mirror door shuddered once, then sealed itself shut, the fragments locking back into their chaotic mosaic. The glow faded. Clara's breathing was ragged, her hands still bleeding. Hale steadied her, though his own face was pale. That wasn't just a room, he said hoarsely. That was something else. Something your family opened a long time ago. Clara looked back at the sealed mirror door. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was walking in her grandfather's shadow. She felt like she was standing in front of his unfinished war. And she knew the door wasn't done with her. The house was darker than it had ever been. Not just in the physical sense, though the storm raging outside made every candle flame stutter and stretch shadows to grotesque lengths, but in the way silence carried a weight, oppressive and suffocating. Every breath, every movement felt swallowed by the unseen presence that had been lurking ever since the mirror door revealed itself. Detective Marlowe stood in the library with his hand resting on the edge of the desk where the late Henry Calderon's journal still lay open. The ink was faded, but the words were as sharp as knives. The key will pass to the one who dares to look. But to inherit the shadows is to inherit the curse. He read it again, his eyes lingering on the last line. The curse. The word had repeated itself across every artifact they had uncovered, in the carvings on the whispering key, in the collector's letters, in the stories that seemed to trail generations of Calderons like a scent of rot. And now, Marlowe felt it, an unease that had seeped into the very walls of this house. Dr. Evelyn Blackthorne hovered near the shelves, her gloved hands brushing the spines of books she hadn't dared to pull out. "Do you feel it too?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a tremor she tried to mask. Marlowe didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the mirror that now stood at the far end of the room, its frame carved with shapes too twisted to be ornamental. The mirror door, pried from the hidden chamber and propped upright, reflected not just their bodies, but something more. Their reflections seemed elongated, as if the mirror showed them not as they were, but as they could become. "Yes," he admitted finally. "It's as though the house itself is waiting, watching." Evelyn stepped closer to the mirror, her face pale in the dim light. "Henry Calderon wasn't just keeping a collection of artifacts," she whispered. "He was keeping something contained, something that should never have been passed on." Marlowe's jaw tightened. "And now it's fallen to us." The letter. That evening, as the storm raged harder, they discovered a sealed envelope tucked inside the false bottom of Calderon's desk drawer. The wax bore the same insignia that had appeared on the whispering key, a circle split by a jagged line, like lightning breaking the sky. Evelyn sliced it open with steady hands, though her breath betrayed her unease. Inside was a letter, written in Calderon's jagged scrawl. "To the one who finds this, the inheritance is not wealth, nor land, nor title. It is a burden. The collector was not the first, nor will he be the last. Each heir to the shadow inheritance is chosen not by blood, but by will, by curiosity, You who read this now are already marked. Beware the mirror door. What waits beyond is not salvation, but memory. And memory can consume you. Marlowe felt the weight of those words settle like stones in his gut. The word clung to him like a second skin. He glanced again at the mirror, noticing how his reflection's eyes seemed just a fraction too dark, too hollow. Marked, Evelyn echoed under her breath. We're not just investigating a crime, Marlowe. We're entangled in it. This inheritance, it's already chosen us. The inheritance. The next morning, when the storm broke, they tried to leave. But the house would not let them. Doors that had once led to the gardens opened onto brick walls. Windows showed nothing but fog. The house itself had sealed them in, folding corridors into unfamiliar turns, as though it had reshaped itself overnight. This is impossible, Evelyn whispered, her scientific rationality unraveling. Architecture can't just shift. It's not the architecture, Marlowe said grimly, pulling the whispering key from his coat pocket. It's the inheritance. When he turned the key in his hand, the faintest whisper curled from it again, not words this time, but laughter. Cold, thin and childlike. Evelyn recoiled, but Marlowe tightened his grip. They wandered through the distorted halls, led by instinct more than direction, until they found themselves once again before the mirror door. This time, however, the reflection was not their own. Instead, the mirror showed the Calderons, Henry, his father, and men before him, all standing in an endless line stretching into shadow. Their faces were pale masks, their eyes black hollows. Each one held the same key. Each one stared directly at Marlowe. Evelyn clutched his arm, her voice breaking. They're waiting. For us. Marlowe nodded slowly. He finally understood. The inheritance was not money, nor power, nor even knowledge. It was a cycle. Each generation bound to the shadows of the one before. And now the cycle had reached them. That night, Evelyn found Marlowe at the desk again, reading through the journal for the 100th time. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt. We can't stay here, she said firmly, though her own voice shook. If we stay, it will consume us, just like it did the Calderons. We have to break the cycle. Marlowe looked up at her. And how do you break something older than we are? Something written into the walls of this place. Evelyn's gaze flicked toward the mirror. By refusing the inheritance. By refusing to look. But it was already too late. Marlowe's reflection moved before he did. It raised its hand as if to beckon him closer. Its mouth curled into a smile he did not make. The shadows already know us, Marlowe said hoarsely. The question isn't whether we take the inheritance. It's whether we survive it. The mirror door pulsed once, faintly, like a heartbeat. And in that moment, both of them realized, the final test of the inheritance was yet to come. The night of shadows. The house did not sleep that night. Every corridor groaned. Every door whispered. The portraits on the walls seemed to follow them with their eyes. Evelyn swore she heard footsteps pacing outside her chamber, though when she flung the door open, the hall was empty. Marlowe, in his room, dreamt of the mirror, of himself standing on the other side, holding the key with blood dripping from his fingers. When the clock struck midnight, the two of them were drawn once more to the library as if summoned. The mirror glowed faintly, silver rippling across its surface. Evelyn held Marlowe's arm tightly. If we open it, we might not come back. If we don't, Marlowe glanced at the distorted halls, the vanishing exits, the laughter that still echoed faintly. We're already gone. They stood before the mirror, the whispering key between them. It pulsed with heat, demanding to be used. And as the storm outside gave way to silence, Marlowe slid the key into the carved lock at the mirror's base. The reflection smiled wider. The mirror door opened. The inheritance had chosen. And as the cold dark beyond the mirror swallowed them whole, the house seemed to sigh, settling once more into silence, awaiting the next heir who dared to look. The storm had passed overnight, but its fury still echoed in the battered trees and the thick mud lining the roads. Detective Mara Vance drove slowly up the winding hill, her eyes flicking to the manor looming ahead, Harlan's estate, where it all began and where, she knew, it had to end. She had the leather satchel on the seat beside her, heavy with the objects they had uncovered: the old brass key from the mirror door, the fragmented diary of the keymaker, and a blood-stained page from Jonathan Harlan's private ledger. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but they hadn't yet revealed the full picture. Until now. The dawn light caught the frost on the windows of the estate. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum, cold, unyielding, hiding its secrets in shadow. Mara stepped out of the car, boots sinking into the soft ground, and paused. She wasn't alone. Standing at the front steps, waiting, was Nathan Harlan, the last surviving heir. His face was pale, his hands trembling as if he had rehearsed this moment but dreaded its arrival. "You came," he said hoarsely. Mara's hand brushed the satchel. "I didn't have a choice. You called me here." Nathan gave a hollow laugh. "No, the house did. The house that waited." Inside, the manner was different. The oppressive silence Mara had felt before was replaced by a low hum, almost mechanical, like the grinding of gears behind walls. The air was cold, sharp with the scent of dust and mold, but underneath lingered something metallic: blood. She followed Nathan through the entryway. The portraits of Harlan ancestors seemed to watch them as they passed, their painted eyes flickering in the candlelight. "I found it last night," Nathan whispered. "The final room. The place my great-grandfather never wanted anyone to see." They stopped before a door at the end of the hall. It wasn't ornate like the others. Plain wood, scarred by time, yet it radiated power. On its surface, faintly visible in the candlelight, were words scratched by hand. "The last key." Mara drew out the brass key from her satchel. The metal seemed to vibrate in her palm. "It belonged here." Nathan stepped back. "It has to be you." Behind the door. The key slid into the lock with an ease that felt inevitable. The tumblers clicked, the door shuddered, and then it swung open. Beyond was a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. A breath of stale air rushed upward, carrying with it the smell of decay. Mara tightened her grip on her flashlight and began to descend, Nathan following reluctantly behind her. The steps groaned under their weight, as if the house itself protested their trespass. The hum grew louder, morphing into whispers, snatches of words, half-formed sentences. Mara's skin prickled. She couldn't tell if they were real or the echo of her own fear. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a cavernous chamber. Rows upon rows of shelves lined the walls, each holding locked boxes of varying sizes. Some were wooden, others iron, a few made of glass, their contents glinting in the flashlight beam. It was an archive of horrors. "The collector's true vault," Mara breathed. Nathan's voice cracked. This is where he kept them all. Not just the artifacts, but the evidence. The trophies. Proof of what he and his accomplices did. On a central pedestal rested a single chest, different from the rest. Smaller, built of blackened steel, with an inscription burned into the lid. "Final payment." The truth of the legacy. Mara placed the brass key into the chest's lock. For a moment she hesitated, then turned it. The chest creaked open. Inside were documents, brittle and yellowed with age, alongside a small leather pouch. Mara pulled out the top sheet. It wasn't a ledger or contract. It was a confession. Jonathan Harlan's handwriting stretched across the page, his words unraveling a century of darkness. The Harlans had built their empire not on steel and oil, but on blood. They financed disappearances, murders, and the trafficking of priceless artifacts stolen from across the world. The keymaker had not been a victim, but a partner, an artisan who built special locks and rooms to contain not just objects, but people. Every generation of Harlans had added to the vault, a ritual of inheritance bound by secrecy. To inherit the wealth, one had to add their own contribution. Mara's stomach turned. She flipped through page after page, photographs of missing people, receipts for payments to corrupt officials, and letters to accomplices who had long since vanished into history. Finally, she opened the small leather pouch. Inside was a single key, unlike the others, black iron, heavy and cold, with the Harlan crest engraved at its head. "The last key," Nathan whispered. "Confrontation." Mara turned to him, her flashlight catching the hollow look in his eyes. "You knew," she said. "You called me here because you couldn't carry this alone." But you didn't bring me just to witness it, did you? Nathan's lips trembled. He took a step closer to the pedestal. Do you understand what this means? If this gets out, the Harlan name is finished. The estate, the wealth, the legacy, gone. That's the price of truth. He shook his head violently. No, you don't understand. The last key, it's not just symbolic. It opens something. My great-grandfather wrote about it. A door beneath this room. The final chamber. Mara steadied herself. And what's inside? Nathan's voice dropped to a whisper. What every Harlan tried to bury. Their ultimate sin. The door beneath. At the far end of the vault, hidden behind a curtain of rotted canvas, they found it. Another door, smaller, made of black iron. No inscription, just the Harlan crest etched into its surface. Mara lifted the black iron key. It slid in perfectly. With a grinding screech, the door opened. The stench that poured out was overwhelming. Mara gagged, pulling her scarf over her mouth as she shone the light inside. It was a crypt. Bodies lined the walls, mummified by time, chained to iron hooks. Dozens of them, some with personal effects still clutched in skeletal hands. Children's shoes. A soldier's badge. A woman's locket. Nathan stumbled back, retching. Mara's light caught something carved into the far wall. The debt is eternal. Her breath hitched. The Harlans hadn't just collected objects, they had collected lives. This was their inheritance, passed down, locked away so the world would never know. Nathan collapsed to his knees, sobbing. It's too much. I can't carry this. Mara stood over him, the last key heavy in her hand. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Expose the truth, and bring down not just Nathan, but the entire legacy of one of the wealthiest families in the country. Or bury it again, locking the secret away where no one could find it. Her eyes swept the chamber one last time. The faces of the dead seemed to stare back, demanding justice. She made her choice. Weeks later, headlines filled the papers. Harlan dynasty collapses amid scandal. Vault of horrors discovered beneath estate. Century-old crimes exposed. Detective Mara Vance stood outside the estate as investigators swarmed the property. Trucks carried out box after box of evidence. The vault was dismantled, its contents catalogued and preserved for trials that would ripple through the country for years.